Great. Thank you. So like some of the other discussants, welcome the report. It's particularly good to see the report looking at sort of progress as well as failures, not just lamenting failures of response, but recognizing advances and progress since 2005. I was going to pick up on 2, maybe 3 points. The report talks about cash being underutilized, and I'd probably agree with that, although obviously the need to care for where cash is and isn't appropriate. But just on the subject of cash, I think there's a danger of sort of seeing it as more of a panacea than it's likely to be, because of the issue that not enough cash isn't that much better or more helpful than not enough food. And that arguably that's the problem, not the choice of mechanism, but the fact that just assistance is inadequate, particularly for the poorest group that's being identified in the report. And so a shift to cash might help at the margin, but if the problem is simply that people aren't getting enough assistance, then the fact they're getting it in cash isn't going to be that much more helpful than getting it in food. And if cash isn't adjusted for inflation, then in fact it's less helpful, because the value of what they're getting erodes, particularly at a time of high rising food prices. Where I think there's most potential, and the report talks about it a bit, is in the potential of development actors to take social protection seriously, and the need for political will in doing that. So if you were thinking about a report in 2015 and what advances might have been made then, if you had in place nationally owned and delivered social protection at scale that helped the most vulnerable to be more resilient to shocks, that would be a tremendous advance. And it would also have the potential to be a tremendous advance for the humanitarian response, because the humanitarian response could use the social protection systems already identified to scale up and enable a more effective and earlier response to shocks. So I think if I was sort of expressing a wish for what might be different in 5 years' time, that would be it. Second point is around the point of sort of how a crisis is recognized. And the problem that you see both in 2005 and in the recent crisis, that declaring a crisis on the part of government is politically embarrassing and they're reluctant to do it, but that donors often can't start to provide serious humanitarian resources until a crisis is declared by governments. And there's a need for a different mechanism for that to happen. So you can have all the joint preparedness and contingency planning you want, but until that's also dealt with, there'll still be that problem. Having said which, as Camilla was talking about, there still isn't enough joint preparedness and contingency planning. International humanitarian and development actors need to be better at working constructively with states to get them involved and engaged in both recognizing crises and responding to them. And the final point, as Peter was talking to me, it was reminding me of work I did a while ago on the sort of interlinkages between the HIV/AIDS and food crisis in Southern Africa in the early 2000s, and that being both a chronic crisis and an acute crisis. And I was wondering sort of what had changed around that, and partly what changed was what some of you people here have been talking about. It was getting development aid to take the chronic crisis of HIV/AIDS seriously. And over the last 10 years, you've seen massive resources put into dealing more effectively with HIV/AIDS. And I guess that would be another wish for 2015, is if development actors were taking the resilience agenda seriously, and if much stronger resources were coming from development aid to tackling resilience and disaster risk reduction. And I was thinking, is that at all likely? And I think maybe where there's most traction and where some of the most exciting work is going on is around tackling malnutrition as a chronic problem as well as an acute one. And I think hopefully Echo will talk more about that. But if you could get, as massive a resources have gone in tackling HIV/AIDS in Southern Africa to go into tackling malnutrition in the Sahel, then that might go some way towards creating greater resilience linked with my social protection wish.